Hello and welcome to the France 24 Debate. Today we're discussing Iran's latest diplomatic moves and how the future looks for Syria. This as Iran's foreign minister visits Damascus. Mohammad Zarif meeting Syrian officials to discuss Tehran's plan to help resolve Syria's four-year conflict. The plan reportedly includes the formation of a national unity government and has been submitted to the UN. My guests tonight are Miriam Benrad, a Middle East Research Fellow at the Institute for Research and Studies on the Arab and Muslim World in Aix-en-Provence and the Foundation for Strategic Research here in Paris. Hello, thank you very much indeed for coming in. Joining us from New York City is Tony Badran. He's a Research Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Hello, and thank you very much indeed for your time. Turning to you first, Miriam, could you start off by telling us a little bit more about Iran's plan for Syria? It's an honourable one. We understand that there's a ceasefire on there, the formation of a unity government, elections as well, but is it a realistic plan?
Well, first, I think let's put some context in all of this. The nuclear agreement clearly has changed the context. There has been an intensity in diplomatic contacts between Iran, Saudi Arabia, Russia, the US, also Turkey, that is without a precedent. At the same time, the plans for a Syrian transition have been on the table for some time now. The real question, and we can go further into the details of what the Iranians are proposing, but the real question, today is whether the Iranians and the regional players can still have an impact on a situation which on the ground isn't that easy. I mean, of course, there are the proxy wars waged by each of these regional players, but there's also the depth and complexity of the Syrian conflict itself, and it will be extremely difficult, whether it comes from the Iranians or from another player, including, of course, the US and Russia, to settle the situation. There's, of course, the question of what will be the future of Assad. It's a central issue. The question of which opposition are we talking about? And there's a number of uncertainties surrounding this question. Which transition? What will the next regime look like? Etc. etc. After 5 years of full-blown violence, which is absolutely terrible, I mean, which has been disastrous, with thousands, hundreds of thousands dead, it's not going to be settled magically. Let's be very clear and honest on this.
And we probably won't cover it all in just 10 minutes or so of debate, but we will talk a little bit more about the regional players and the situation on the ground in a moment. But first, if I could just turn to you, Tony Badran, joining us from New York City. Now, as Miriam was just saying, there have been attempts in the past to try and resolve the conflict, none of them succeeding. Is it perhaps time now to really listen to Iran and take notice of this plan?
No, I don't think this is. I don't think that any of this diplomatic flurry that we're seeing is actually substantive. I think it's more an attempt by Iran to create the perception, or to actually cash in on the perception, very much encouraged by the Obama administration in Washington, that it is now a central interlocutor that needs to be brought into the table to discuss Syria. That's really the whole purpose of this diplomatic dance between Washington and Iran at this point. But in terms of the actual substance of what the Iranians are proposing, there has been absolutely no change, and I will venture to say that there will be no change, because this is really very much an issue of it's essentially a zero-sum game, in the sense that the Iranians are backing Assad, and there cannot be a solution where Assad stays in power, and that's really the dilemma. And so unless so the idea that somehow they can be a solution, which is what the Obama administration, I think, is hoping, that kind of balances the interests of all the stakeholders: Iran, Saudi Arabia, Russia, Jordan, Turkey, and so on, is, I think, actually fanciful. It would be akin to proposing that the Lebanese civil war in the 1980s, for there to be a solution to that war, we need to somehow find a solution that accommodates the interests of, the PLO, the Israelis, the Iranians, the Iraqis, and the Syrians and the Soviet all at once. It's just not feasible.
You call it a diplomatic dance, but Iran, with its support for Hezbollah and Hezbollah's important role in terms of keeping Bashar al-Assad's forces going in the face of great opposition, does that not give Iran a key role in bringing about a solution to this problem?
No, it gives it a key role. I don't think it gives it a key role in bringing about a solution. It gives it a key role in the sense that the Assad regime cannot survive without Iranian help. But at the same time, the Iranian interest in Syria is to preserve the regime, and the function of that preservation is to preserve its own foothold in Syria, which in turn serves to preserve its influence and connection to Hezbollah, for which it can then transfer weapons and maintain a presence on the Eastern Mediterranean. Now, it is this interest of Iran which is in stark conflict with the interests of all the other regional players in the region, from the Sunni states as well as Israel.
Miriam, like you said before, we're not entirely sure what this plan will mean for Assad, but as far as we understand, Iran is putting pressure on Bashar al-Assad to accept some sort of plan, and he might even end up accepting a lesser role if a unity government is formed. So is that not Iran showing some flexibility? Because Tony there was saying that Iran will only want to keep Bashar al-Assad in place, but perhaps they will end up mellowing on this just like the Russians did.
Well, I mean, first, let's put things clearly. There's nobody really here willing to settle these conflicts because, as was said by Tony, and a lot of people agree on this, regional players have waged proxy wars and hegemonic wars for now years. And it's not only in Syria, it's the case also, of course, in Iraq. And none of these regional players really has an interest in seeing Iraq and Syria recovering their weight regionally. So this is really purely wars of hegemony and divergent interests. And there's a sort of paradox which is quite blatant in asking or waiting from these players, which have been spoilers in many cases, a solution, a so-called solution. So I agree with the idea that the solution in the end ultimately will come from the Syrians, just like it will probably come from the Iraqis. At the same time, we can't neglect the extent of regional interferences in this conflict. So this is an impasse. This is a very, very complex path that everybody is taking. To answer you on Syria and Assad, Assad owes his survival to the Iranians. This regime would have fallen a long time ago if the Iranians were not around to hold it. The question, of course, now is Assad. To what extent are the Iranians ready to back Assad, knowing that Assad has lost the battle? This is quite clear. To what extent will the regime or the remnants from the regime, which we know are so closely attached to the Assad clan, be part of the so-called transition? On this, the opposition disagrees. You have different trends within the Syrian opposition, more or less ready to agree on the principle of having parts of the regime involved, etc. So this is why I'm telling you that, and I agree with Mr. Badran on this, there will be no magical or easy solution or transition plan. And the other question is towards which regime and which transition? What are we talking about exactly?
Well, I'd just like to talk about the Saudis right now with you, Tony. Saudis have obviously long insisted on Assad's departure. A meeting took place in Riyadh in July between the Saudi defense minister and the Syrian security chief. What was that about, in your opinion?
Well, first of all, it's actually not confirmed that the meeting actually took place. There are conflicting reports on this matter. with some very high-ranking Saudis denying it took place and others saying that it did, but not in the way that it has been reported. In whatever the case may be, two things on this issue. First, that this was the Saudis and the Russians. This was not the Saudis and the Iranians. And there are two distinct movements here, one by the Russians and one by the Iranians. And the Iranians didn't share their initiative with the Saudis. Zarif didn't include Saudi Arabia in his trip. So there are two different tracks. And in this particular one, with the Russians, the Saudis were, I think, just trying to show the Russians, on the one hand, that they are very willing to accommodate remnants of the regime and state institutions and Russian interests. However, what the Saudis said about that whole alleged meeting was that their position is that Iranian forces and pro-Iranian militias, Iraqi and Hezbollah, all need to be completely withdrawn from Syria before there's any movement towards a solution. And that solution, by the way, cannot have Bashar al-Assad, who will need to be deposed either peacefully or through military
I'm really
action.
sorry to interrupt, but we're running out of time. I'd just like to put one more question to you, Miriam. Two quick things, if you could mention them both briefly. Turkey playing a role in the partial ceasefire that was implemented that's underway right now. That's a new approach in the region. And maybe a quick word on, is there a danger of Syria becoming like Libya?
Well, I mean, you can draw all sorts of comparisons with Libya, with Iraq. There's a fragmentation. There's very little likelihood that we are going to go back to a national unity thing. This is an illusion at this stage, at least in my mind. We are going towards a federalization, devolution, just like in the case of Iraq, if we're talking about concrete realities and not what Western policies are envisaging. Regarding Turkey, Turkey is coming very late into all of this, has played a very ambiguous and serious role in allowing, as we know, hundreds of jihadists to join the Syrian insurgency, just like Syria had done with Iraq during the American occupation. This is why I'm telling you that nobody is really ready to show the courage that is needed to settle these conflicts. There's a level of cynicism which is unbelievable. Given again, I mean, let's come back to civilian populations. A level of cynicism which is unbelievable if you consider the number of dead in this story, and this is absolutely appalling. So let's be very cautious regarding Turkey and the efforts that Ankara is ready to make.
Okay, well, we'll have to leave it there. We've run out of time. Thank you very much, though, Miriam Benrad, for coming in. And thanks, Tony Badran in New York City. Afraid we'll have to leave it there. Thank you all for watching. Do stay tuned to France 24.